For years, the West believed China could never threaten its dominance in commercial aviation. Even China's most advanced jets, like the C919 and the upcoming C929, still relied heavily on Western components, especially the LEAP-1C engine from CF International. But that belief may no longer hold true. China has unveiled something that could completely rewrite the rules of the game: the CJ2000, a next-generation jet engine developed by AECC, the Aero Engine Corporation of China. This engine isn't just another upgrade. It's a direct challenge to the technological leadership of Rolls-Royce and General Electric. For decades, China has pursued a single goal: to create a truly independent aviation industry. With COMAC leading the charge, that mission began with the C919, a narrow-body jet meant to compete with Boeing's 737 and Airbus's A320. On paper, the C919 matched its Western rivals in capacity and range, and it offered Chinese airlines a cheaper alternative. But despite its made-in-China label, it remained deeply dependent on imported systems, from avionics to landing gear, and especially its Western-built engines. Still, COMAC reached a historic milestone when the C919 entered commercial service and completed its first international flight to Hong Kong. Yet, without certification from the FAA or EASA, it couldn't break into global markets undeterred. China looked higher to the skies of long-haul travel. The C929 project was born, designed to compete with the Boeing 787 and Airbus, the 350. Originally a joint venture with Russia, known as the CR929. The partnership collapsed after Western sanctions on Moscow. China pressed on alone, rebranding it as the C929 and continuing development in Shanghai. But there was still one major obstacle: the engine. Building a wide-body aircraft is complex, and without an independent power source, China's ambitions remained grounded. That was until November 2023, at the Shanghai International Commercial Air Show. AECC revealed the CJ2000 engine, a full-scale model built to power the C929. It was more than a technical demonstration. It was a declaration of independence. China no longer wanted to assemble aircraft using Western technology. It wanted to master the art of flight itself. The CJ is a significant leap forward from the earlier CJ engine built for the C919, designed with advanced composite materials, high bypass ratios, and aerodynamic optimization. It promises greater thrust and lower fuel consumption. Its turbine inlet temperature reportedly reaches 2,200 Kelvin, about 225 degrees, higher than that of Rolls-Royce's Trent XWB-97, one of the world's most advanced engines. With a thrust range of 78,000 to 84,000 pounds, it stands toe-to-toe with the Trent XWB-84 and the GE Trent 1000, the power behind today's top long-haul jets. Testing began in 2023, with flight tests expected by the end of 2024. If successful, China could finally achieve what it's been striving for: full control of its aviation supply chain. But while the numbers are impressive, challenges remain. Designing a jet engine is one thing. Proving its reliability is another. Western manufacturers like GE and Rolls-Royce have spent decades refining their engines. AECC still needs to demonstrate that the CJ2000 can meet international safety and efficiency standards. Certification from the FAA and EASA remains a distant goal. Even so, this is much more than a technical milestone. It's a strategic declaration, a statement that China intends to free itself from Western dependency at a time of increasing geopolitical tension. Successful CJ2 would allow China to build and export aircraft entirely powered by domestic technology. A huge step toward global aviation influence, of course. Turning ambition into trust is the real challenge. Most of COMAC C's orders still come from domestic airlines, and international carriers remain cautious. Without proven long-term reliability and global certification, China's jets will continue to face skepticism. But things are starting to shift. Malaysia has already expressed interest in purchasing the C919, a sign that foreign markets are beginning to take notice. China isn't chasing short-term victories. It's playing the long game, investing billions in infrastructure, training, and new technologies, from navigation systems to hypersonic research. Every move is part of a calculated strategy to secure its place among the aviation giants. COMAC doesn't need to dethrone Boeing and Airbus overnight. It just needs persistence to keep improving, expanding production, and winning the world's trust one flight at a time, if it succeeds. The skies of the next 2 decades may look very different, because the next era of aviation might not belong to the West alone. Stay tuned. The race for the skies has only just begun. By early 2025, whispers began circulating through aviation circles. The CJ2000 was no longer just a concept. AECC engineers had completed their first full engine ground test cycle, and according to insider reports, the results were beyond expectations. Satellite images revealed new testing facilities being rapidly expanded near Shanghai, with massive structures believed to house next-generation wind tunnels and endurance rigs. China was preparing for something big, a full integration test between the C929 and its new heart. The CJ2000 Western analysts initially dismissed these developments as posturing. But when leaked footage surfaced showing a CJ2000 prototype successfully completing a simulated long-duration run, doubt started to fade. For the first time, the world realized this was no longer a paper project. Behind the scenes, COMAC engineers were working around the clock to synchronize the C929's airframe with the new engine. Every component, from the nacelles to the flight control software, was undergoing revision. The C929's design itself had evolved, featuring lighter composite materials and improved aerodynamics. By mid-2026, test fuselages began appearing on the tarmac at Shanghai Pudong, and speculation grew that the first prototype could roll out within a year. Chinese state media, usually cautious about such announcements, started releasing cryptic teasers, phrases like, "A new chapter in the skies begins soon." Then, in late 2026, something extraordinary happened. For the first time, a C929 prototype, powered by twin CJ2000 engines, conducted a low-speed taxi test. Though brief, the sight of the massive aircraft moving under its own power sent shockwaves through the global aviation community. Footage of the event flooded social media, engineers cheering as the engines roared to life, the COMAC logo gleaming under the floodlights. It was a symbolic moment, the first Chinese wide-body aircraft powered entirely by domestic technology. But while the celebration was loud, the challenges ahead were louder. The engine still needed thousands of hours of endurance testing. Reliability, efficiency, and certification remained the towering mountains ahead. Western aerospace experts warned that even with a successful rollout, the road to commercial readiness could take another decade. Yet, Beijing wasn't deterred. The government doubled down, announcing billions in new funding for aviation research. New partnerships were forged with countries participating in the Belt and Road Initiative, nations eager to buy cheaper aircraft alternatives without Western restrictions. Meanwhile, Boeing and Airbus quietly began to feel the pressure. With rising production costs, regulatory delays, and geopolitical risks, airlines in developing regions were looking east for options. By 2028, COMAC's domestic fleet had expanded across Asia. The C919 was flying routes from Shanghai to Bangkok, Kuala Lumpur, and Dubai. Airlines praised its fuel efficiency, and the aircraft's performance began earning cautious respect. Then, one morning in 2029, a single announcement captured the world's attention. COMAC C929, powered by AECC 2000 engines, has successfully completed its maiden flight. The test flight lasted over 3 hours. Cruising above the East China Sea, reports confirmed stable engine performance, smooth handling, and minimal vibration. The aircraft returned to the runway with a flawless landing, met with thunderous applause from engineers, officials, and journalists. For the first time in aviation history, a wide-body jet, built and powered entirely in China, had taken to the skies. Western aerospace experts watched the footage with a mix of disbelief and respect. Decades of dominance had finally met a real challenger. But this wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. The CJ2000 still had to face its toughest test yet: certification and real-world service. Could it maintain reliability over millions of flight hours? Could it convince global airlines to trust a Chinese-made engine with hundreds of passengers aboard? China's aviation dream had finally taken off, but now it had to stay in the air. And as the C929 disappeared into the clouds that day, one thing became clear: the balance of power in the skies was shifting. The next era of aviation would no longer be written in Seattle or Toulouse, but in Shanghai. Would you like me to continue the story into the 2030s? Showing how COMAC begins exporting the C929 and how the US and Europe respond. By the early 2030s, the C929 had become more than just an aircraft. It had become a symbol. Across China, the maiden flight was replayed endlessly on television, hailed as proof that the nation could finally soar without foreign wings. But inside the world's aerospace boardrooms, the mood was different: uneasy, cautious, and alert. In Toulouse, Airbus executives convened emergency strategy sessions. The Chinese widebody, though still uncertified in Western markets, was beginning to attract attention from Asia, Africa, and South America. For airlines long priced out of buying Western jets, the C929 offered something new: long-haul range at a fraction of the cost. In Seattle, Boeing faced its own storm. Production delays, supply chain chaos, and political scrutiny had left the company vulnerable. When leaked reports suggested that several African nations were in talks with COMAC to purchase the C929 under long-term financing agreements backed by Beijing, alarms went off. The age of unchallenged Western dominance in aviation was officially over. Meanwhile, the CJ2000 engine continued to surprise. After thousands of hours of testing, AECC released data showing sustained performance with minimal degradation, a benchmark that even Western experts called impressive. More remarkably, it achieved these results without access to the decades of proprietary material science that companies like Rolls-Royce had built by 2032. The C929 entered limited service with several Chinese airlines and a handful of partners from countries aligned with the Belt and Road Initiative. Routes connecting Shanghai to Nairobi, Jakarta, and Istanbul became the proving grounds for China's new aviation empire. At first, passengers were hesitant. A wide-body aircraft not made by Boeing or Airbus felt unfamiliar, even risky. But as months passed and flight records stayed clean, perceptions began to shift. The C929 was quieter than expected, and surprisingly comfortable. Western regulators still withheld certification, citing the need for further data on engine reliability. But insiders knew the real reason. Certifying the C929 meant legitimizing China as a direct competitor, and that was something Washington and Brussels weren't ready to do. In response, Beijing accelerated its own system of global aviation partnerships. Chinese engineers began offering maintenance training, spare parts programs, and localized service centers across Asia and Africa. It wasn't just selling airplanes, it was building an ecosystem by 2035. The numbers told a story few could ignore. COMAC had captured nearly 8% of the global commercial aviation market. Small, but enough to shift the balance of power. Boeing and Airbus still dominated transatlantic skies, but the developing world was rapidly embracing Chinese-built aircraft. Then came the shock that changed everything. In 2036, the International Aviation Authority recognized the CJ2000 as fully compliant with global safety and environmental standards. Overnight, the C929 became eligible for global operation. The announcement sent ripples through the industry. Within months, orders poured in. Latin American carriers, struggling with the cost of Western jets, signed multi-billion-dollar deals. Middle Eastern airlines seeking diversification joined the wave. Even a European low-cost carrier quietly placed an order, the first in the continent's history for a Chinese aircraft. The West tried to respond. Rolls-Royce announced a new ultra-efficient engine program. Boeing rushed to unveil its Project Horizon concept, a next-generation aircraft aimed at regaining its edge. But it was clear China had already achieved what once seemed impossible. At Shanghai Pudong Airport, a new terminal was dedicated to COMAC's expanding fleet. Giant banners hung across the hangars, independence in the skies. The transformation was complete. What began as a dream, a challenge to Boeing and Airbus, had become a geopolitical reality. Yet, even as China celebrated, a quiet understanding lingered among its engineers and pilots. This was not the end. but the beginning of a new competition, one fought not just in technology, but in trust, perception, and influence. Because while the CJ2000 had conquered the air, the true battle for hearts, minds, and markets had only just begun. Would you like me to continue the story into the 2040s, where China pushes for a next-gen hybrid or hydrogen engine, and Western powers respond with a technological alliance to reclaim dominance? By the early 2040s, the skies above Earth had become a new kind of battlefield, silent, gleaming, and fiercely competitive. The C929 and its CJ2000 engines were no longer novelties. They were workhorses, connecting continents across Asia, Africa, and the Middle East. COMAC had risen to become the third pillar of global aviation, standing shoulder to shoulder with Boeing and Airbus. But China's ambitions had never been about being third. It wanted to lead. And so, Beijing turned its gaze toward the next frontier, green flight. In 2041, under the banner of the Sky Independence Initiative, AECC and COMAC unveiled a radical concept, the CJ-H1, a hybrid hydrogen propulsion system designed to eliminate carbon emissions entirely. Unlike earlier Western prototypes, which remained mostly experimental, the CJ-H1 project was announced with a clear, bold deadline, a flight-ready prototype within 5 years. At first, the West laughed. Rolls-Royce, GE, and Pratt & Whitney had spent decades researching alternative propulsion with limited results. Hydrogen engines were complex, volatile, and required a global refueling infrastructure that barely existed. But this time, China had something no one else did: momentum. With the world's largest domestic aviation network, state-backed funding, and control over critical supply chains, China began converting select airports into hybrid hydrogen test hubs. What seemed impossible for private companies became achievable for a nation willing to plan decades ahead. Meanwhile, Western aerospace powers realized that the balance of innovation was slipping. Boeing's Project Horizon, once touted as the future of American aviation, had suffered cost overruns and design setbacks. Airbus' hydrogen prototype, the ZERO, made progress. But political divisions within the EU slowed deployment in 2044. A quiet yet historic meeting took place in Geneva. For the first time in nearly half a century, Boeing, Airbus, and Rolls-Royce formed a joint strategic alliance project, Phoenix, aimed at developing a unified next-generation engine that could compete with China's rapidly advancing CJ-H1 program. The message was clear. The West had finally understood that the competition was existential, but China was already 2 steps ahead at a secretive test facility in Chengdu. Engineers rolled out a modified C929 testbed equipped with twin CJ-H1 engines. Unlike traditional hydrogen turbines, these were using superconducting systems to channel excess energy through onboard batteries. Technology developed from China's high-speed rail and quantum computing sectors. On June 12, 2045, the aircraft took off for the first time. Silent, sleek, and emitting nothing but water vapor. It soared over Sichuan province at 35,000 feet. When it landed, state media called it the cleanest flight in human history. The aviation world went into shock. Western analysts scrambled to verify the data, but satellite imagery and telemetry confirmed it. The CJ-H1 had achieved sustained hydrogen-electric flight with stability levels previously thought impossible. Overnight, the narrative shifted from competition to survival. Project Phoenix accelerated its efforts, but internal rivalries and resource shortages hindered progress. China, meanwhile, offered to cooperate with developing nations by exporting its new green technology, a diplomatic masterstroke that expanded its influence even further. By 2048, over a dozen countries had signed agreements to adopt China's hydrogen infrastructure model. Airports in Kenya, Indonesia, and Brazil began installing CJ-H1-compatible systems. For the first time, global aviation was no longer built around Western standards. It was built around Shanghai's blueprint. And then, the world witnessed a moment no one could have imagined 30 years earlier. In 2049, exactly 1 century after the founding of the People's Republic of China, a CJ-H1-powered C939, the successor to the C929, completed the first hydrogen-powered trans-Pacific flight from Shanghai to Los Angeles. Crowds gathered at LAX to watch the landing. Journalists, engineers, even competitors stood in stunned silence as the aircraft rolled to a stop. The jet bore a single line across its fuselage, "Made in China, powered by tomorrow." The symbolism was impossible to ignore. The same nation, once dismissed as a mere assembler of Western engines, had now created the world's cleanest, longest-range aircraft and flown it halfway across the world into the very heart of its former rivals. In that moment, it wasn't just a technological triumph, it was a geopolitical one. The balance of power in aviation, and perhaps in the modern world, had officially shifted east. Would you like me to continue the story into the 2050s, showing how AI-controlled flight, global alliances, and space-based propulsion begin to redefine what aviation even means?